The transformer was still smoking when I saw her pull up. Not metaphorically smoking either. I mean actual gray smoke curling up into the Tennessee summer air, while a county utility worker stood nearby, taking pictures like he'd just arrived at the scene of a crime. Then out stepped a woman named Victoria Langford, president of our HOA, wearing oversized sunglasses and the kind of smile people get when they're absolutely convinced they've won. She didn't even look at the utility crew. She didn't look at the damaged equipment. She looked straight at my house. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. About 16 hours earlier, she'd managed to convince a contractor and half the HOA board that my electrical system was some kind of dangerous threat to the neighborhood. After months of threats, fines, letters, and meetings, she'd finally gotten what she wanted. My power had been cut. At least that's what she thought. I was standing on my porch holding a glass of iced tea when the air conditioner behind me kicked on with a low hum. The porch lights were on. The ceiling fan in my living room was spinning. My security cameras were recording every second. Victoria's smile disappeared so fast, it almost made me laugh. She froze for a second, staring at the house, then at me, then back at the house again. It was like watching someone discover gravity had suddenly stopped working. "How was that possible?" she muttered. Now, to understand why that moment mattered so much, I need to back up a little. My name is Daniel Mercer. 3 years earlier, after retiring from a long career designing independent energy systems, I bought a ranch-style house outside a small town I'll call Brookhaven Ridge. It sat on nearly 2 acres, far enough away from traffic to hear birds in the morning and coyotes at night. What I didn't know when I signed the closing papers was that the neighborhood had recently been absorbed into a growing HOA that seemed determined to regulate every blade of grass and every ounce of common sense out of existence. At first, things were quiet. I spent my first year building something I'd dreamed about for decades. I installed a large solar array on my roof. I added a battery storage system in the basement. I connected everything through a sophisticated transfer system capable of running the entire property independently from the electrical grid. Every permit was approved. Every inspection passed. Every component was documented. By the end of the second year, my utility bills weren't just low, they were negative. The utility company literally owed me money. To me, it wasn't about saving a few dollars. It was about self-reliance. I'd spent most of my career helping design systems that kept critical facilities operating when the grid failed. Building my own version at home felt like a retirement project with a purpose. Then Victoria Langford showed up. The first time I met her, she drove her luxury SUV halfway up my driveway without being invited. She marched to my front door, carrying a tablet and a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Before I could even say hello, she informed me that my solar panels violated newly adopted HOA architectural standards. Apparently, according to her interpretation, anything visible from the road required prior approval. I explained that the installation had been approved by county inspectors and fully permitted. She smiled politely, the way a teacher smiles at a child who just gave the wrong answer in class. "County approval doesn't override HOA authority," she said. There it was. Authority. That word became her favorite weapon. Every conversation somehow circled back to authority. She wasn't interested in engineering. She wasn't interested in safety. She wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in reminding everyone that she was in charge. I asked when these new architectural standards had been adopted. She hesitated. Then she said they had been approved the previous year. I asked whether homeowners had received proper notice before the rule changes were implemented. That's when her confidence slipped for the first time. It only lasted a second, but I noticed it. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she told me I would be receiving formal documentation soon. 4 days later, a certified letter arrived. $300 per day in fines until the panels were removed. No hearing, no discussion, just a demand. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter twice before calling my attorney. The strange thing wasn't the fine itself. It was how personal everything already felt. Victoria wasn't acting like someone enforcing a rule. She was acting like someone offended that I existed outside her control. And the deeper I looked into the situation, the clearer it became that my solar panels weren't the real problem. They were just the excuse. The actual problem was that somebody in the neighborhood had discovered a way to operate independently, and Victoria couldn't stand it. What neither of us knew at the time was that her obsession with proving her authority was about to collide with 30 years of engineering experience, a mountain of documentation, and one very expensive energy system that didn't care what the HOA thought about it. Now, before I get back to the fireworks, let me explain something because this is where a lot of homeowners get blindsided. According to standard procedure, an HOA can create and enforce community rules, but they generally have to follow their own governing documents when adopting new restrictions. If proper notice isn't given, the entire foundation of enforcement can start to crack. From a legal perspective, that's exactly why documentation matters so much. Most disputes aren't won by whoever talks the loudest. They're won by whoever kept records. But there was another layer here that had nothing to do with paperwork. This is a psychological trap many authority-driven people fall into. Once someone becomes emotionally invested in being right, every disagreement starts feeling like a personal attack. Victoria wasn't really fighting solar panels anymore. She was fighting the uncomfortable possibility that someone had challenged her authority and survived. That's often when reasonable disagreements transform into power struggles. And trust me, when a dispute becomes about ego instead of facts, things usually get a whole lot more expensive for everyone involved. The next letter arrived the following Monday, and that's when I realized Victoria wasn't backing down. The solar panel accusation had apparently failed to scare me, so now she was aiming at something bigger. According to the notice, my property contained non-standard electrical infrastructure inconsistent with community utility expectations. I remember reading that sentence 3 times because it sounded important while meaning absolutely nothing. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, "We don't like it, therefore it's dangerous." The letter demanded that I return my home to a traditional grid-dependent configuration within 30 days or face an additional $500 per day in penalties. I called my attorney, Michael Reeves, and read the letter out loud. When I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he laughed. "Community utility expectations?" he asked. "That's not even a legal term." I told him I knew that. He told me to send him every inspection report, permit, engineering diagram, and approval document I had. Fortunately, I had all of it. Years in engineering teach you one important lesson. If something isn't documented, it effectively never happened. Within 24 hours, Michael had assembled a response so detailed it could have doubled as a textbook. He cited state statutes, county permits, inspection approvals, and procedural defects in the HOA's rule adoption process. It was professional, factual, and impossible to refute. Victoria's response arrived 2 days later. She ignored every legal argument and introduced a new accusation. My system, she claimed, represented a potential safety threat to neighboring properties. No evidence, no engineering report, no inspection findings, just vague references to possible electrical hazards. That was the moment Michael became concerned. "Daniel," he said during a phone call that evening, "people don't invent safety concerns unless they're planning to use them." I asked what that meant. "It means she's building justification for something." He turned out to be exactly right. 4 days later, just after 7 in the morning, a contractor's truck rolled into my driveway. 2 men stepped out wearing safety vests. One carried a clipboard. The other carried a pair of heavy bolt cutters. That's never a comforting combination. The man with the clipboard informed me that they'd been hired by the HOA to disconnect unsafe electrical infrastructure on my property. I told him my system was fully permitted and county approved. He said he was following orders. I told him that if anyone touched my equipment, I would be calling the sheriff before the first wire hit the ground. The man looked uncertain. The guy holding the bolt cutters looked even more uncertain. Eventually, the clipboard guy made a phone call and handed me the phone. Victoria's voice came through immediately. Calm, confident, annoyingly cheerful. "Mr. Mercer, the board has authorized emergency corrective action regarding your electrical installation." I asked what emergency she was referring to. She ignored the question. Instead, she warned me that obstructing authorized work could result in additional penalties. I answered with 4 words. "Call my attorney instead." Then I handed the phone back. The contractors left about 15 minutes later. Apparently, even they weren't eager to become part of whatever disaster Victoria was creating. 20 minutes after they departed, Michael called. He sounded impressed and concerned at the same time. "You know what they just tried to do?" he asked. I told him I had a few guesses. They contacted county officials and tried to convince an electrical inspector to declare your system unsafe. I laughed. The inspector who approved the system originally was still employed by the county. How'd that work out for them? I asked. "Not well," Michael said. Then his tone changed. "Daniel, she's escalating because she's losing. That's dangerous." A few days later, everything finally exploded. Literally. Early that morning, I noticed a county utility truck parked near the transformer serving my property. A utility worker stepped out carrying a clipboard. He examined some paperwork, opened an access panel, and started inspecting equipment. I immediately began recording with my phone. Something fell off. After a few minutes, he spoke briefly into a radio, reached inside the transformer cabinet, and pulled a disconnect lever. My house should have gone dark. Instead, absolutely nothing happened. The lights stayed on. The refrigerator continued humming. The air conditioning never missed a beat. The utility worker stared at my house. Then he stared at the paperwork. Then he stared at the transformer. I could almost hear the confusion from my porch. Eventually, he climbed back into the truck and began making phone calls. 30 minutes later, Victoria arrived. That's where this story began. She stepped out of her SUV expecting victory. What she found instead was a house functioning exactly as it always had. I walked onto the porch carrying a glass of iced tea. The timing wasn't intentional, but I admit it looked fantastic. The air conditioner started running behind me. "Victoria Steve, what did you do?" she demanded. "Nothing," I said. "The system did exactly what it was designed to do." She looked genuinely confused. "Your power was disconnected." "From the grid?" "Yes." "Then why is the house still running?" I took a sip of tea. "Because it hasn't needed grid power in over a year." The silence that followed was beautiful. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that happens when reality punches someone's ego directly in the face. Victoria blinked several times. "That's impossible." "Actually," I said, "it's extremely possible. I spent 30 years designing systems like this." Around that moment, another county vehicle arrived. Out stepped the electrical inspector who had originally approved my installation. We'll call him Robert Hayes. Robert walked directly past Victoria and asked if he could review the system. I showed him everything. The battery storage bank, the inverter logs, the monitoring software, the generation history. 20 minutes later, he emerged carrying printed performance reports. Then he walked directly toward Victoria. "Mrs. Langford," he said, "this residence has been operating independently from the electrical grid for approximately 14 months. Her expression looked like someone had switched languages in the middle of a conversation. Robert continued, "The homeowner's system is fully compliant, fully inspected, and fully operational. The disconnect action taken today had no effect on the residents." Then he paused. "What it may have affected, however, is your legal situation." Suddenly, several conversations started happening at once. The county utility supervisor joined the discussion. Questions were asked about work orders. Questions were asked about safety complaints. Questions were asked about why county resources had been dispatched based on allegations unsupported by evidence. Victoria's confidence began evaporating in real time. By the end of the afternoon, county officials were documenting damaged equipment, reviewing reports, and collecting statements. Fortunately, I had everything recorded. Every letter, every fine notice, every email, every inspection, every permit, every phone call summary, every photograph, every second of video. The lawsuit was filed the following week. From a legal perspective, Victoria had created a disaster for herself. Michael's complaint included harassment, interference with lawful energy infrastructure, false safety allegations, abuse of HOA authority, and multiple statutory violations related to renewable energy protections. Discovery was brutal. Emails surfaced. Internal board communications surfaced. Meeting notes surfaced. The deeper attorneys dug, the worse things became. What emerged wasn't a safety concern. It was a campaign. Several messages revealed that Victoria had become personally obsessed with forcing compliance after I challenged her authority publicly during a board meeting months earlier. The court hearing took place in late summer. Victoria hired a highly respected HOA defense attorney. Unfortunately for him, evidence doesn't care how expensive your lawyer is. County inspectors testified. Utility representatives testified. I testified. Michael presented timelines, permits, logs, and communications that fit together so cleanly they practically told the story themselves. When Victoria's attorney argued that the HOA had acted in good faith out of concern for community safety, the judge asked a simple question. What specific safety hazard existed? Nobody had an answer, because there never had been one. A week later, the ruling arrived. The judge invalidated the HOA restrictions being used against me, ruled that the safety allegations lacked evidentiary support, permanently prohibited future interference with my energy system, and ordered reimbursement of legal fees and damages. The written opinion included a line I still keep framed in my office. It said that community governance does not extend to substituting personal opinions for licensed engineering expertise and government inspection authority. Victoria resigned less than 2 weeks later. Just like that, the woman who had spent months trying to prove she controlled everything discovered she couldn't even control the consequences of her own decisions. A few months after everything ended, life became surprisingly quiet again. The lawsuits were over. The fines had disappeared, the threats stopped showing up in my mailbox, and for the first time in nearly a year, I could sit on my porch without wondering what new problem someone was trying to invent. One October morning, I walked outside with a cup of coffee and looked up at the solar panels covering my roof. The battery system downstairs was nearly full. The previous day's generation report showed I had produced almost twice as much energy as I consumed. Somewhere out there, electricity was flowing back into the grid while I sat there doing absolutely nothing except enjoying the sunrise. And honestly, that felt like the perfect ending. Not because I had beaten Victoria. Not because the judge ruled in my favor. Not even because I recover my legal costs. The real victory was realizing that independence had protected me long before the court ever did. Looking back now, I think a lot of people misunderstand stories like this. They assume it's about solar power, HOA politics, or neighborhood drama. Those things are part of it, sure, but they aren't the heart of the story. The heart of the story is what happens when someone becomes so attached to authority that they stop respecting reality. Victoria wasn't a villain in the comic book sense. She wasn't waking up every morning plotting evil schemes. What happened was actually more common and probably more dangerous. She convinced herself that because she had authority, she automatically had expertise. Once that happened, every disagreement became a challenge to her identity. Every question sounded like disrespect. Every request for evidence felt like rebellion. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in workplaces, schools, governments, families, and yes, HOAs. People start believing that being in charge means being correct. The problem is that reality doesn't work that way. Physics doesn't care about titles. Engineering doesn't care about popularity. Facts don't care who wins the board election. And eventually, reality sends a bill. From a legal perspective, there's another lesson people often miss. Most homeowners panic the moment they receive an official-looking violation letter. They assume that because something is written on letterhead, it must be legitimate. But that's not always true. Rights still exist. Procedures still matter. Due process still matters. According to standard procedure, organizations are generally expected to follow their own rules before enforcing them against others. That's why documentation became my greatest weapon. I didn't win because I was smarter than everyone else. I won because every permit, every inspection, every conversation, every invoice, and every system log was carefully preserved. When the time came, facts spoke louder than accusations. The lesson here is that preparation often looks boring right up until the moment it saves you. Another thing I've thought about a lot is how differently this situation could have ended. Imagine if I had responded emotionally every time Victoria provoked me. Imagine if I had yelled, made threats, or given her the confrontation she wanted. That would have shifted attention away from the facts and toward the conflict itself. Instead, every time she escalated, I focused on evidence. Every time she made claims, I asked for documentation. Every time she tried to create drama, I forced the conversation back to reality. It wasn't exciting at the time, but it turned out to be incredibly effective. And maybe that's the strangest part of the entire story. The person trying hardest to demonstrate power ended up exposing how little she actually had. Meanwhile, the person quietly sitting on his porch ended up with exactly what he wanted all along: peace, independence, and a system that worked. So now I'm curious what you think. Have you ever dealt with an HOA board, property manager, or a local authority figure who became more interested in control than solutions? Do you think Victoria genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood? Or do you think the whole thing became an ego battle the moment someone challenged her? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's probably a good thing. Conversations about power, responsibility, and accountability matter. They remind us that authority should always be supported by competence, and competence should always be supported by evidence. As for me, every now and then I still think about that afternoon when the transformer smoked, the county trucks arrived, and Victoria stood staring at a fully powered house she was certain had just gone dark. It remains one of the most expensive lessons in overconfidence I've ever witnessed. And every time I remember it, I can't help smiling a little, because the truth is she never really had the power she thought she did. She just hadn't figured that out yet.